We are so close to putting this engine into the M715. Here are a few more tasks before that happens.
Now putting the fan pulley hub assembly back together for the 12-valve Cummins. This is basically the inverse of the disassembly. And again, I'm going to choose to use the press for this. We've come up with a piece from my ball joint press kit that is just a little bit smaller than the race on the big bearing that we need to press in, and it's in the replacement. What we want to do with this is basically just press it flush to the front surface of this housing. So in this case, letting the housing sit on the press plate, just pressing it down gets us where we need to be with this. We'll make an adjustment, make sure we're lined up, centered under the press. And it should just press into place. I'm going to take a little bit more than just hand pressure on the press, but add the lever and in it goes. And just like that, we're down. No need to force it or push it further. So that's the first half. Now for the second half. What we're going to do, I'm going to set this up with a little support ring so that we're not pushing directly on the flat or against the threads of this piece. So this will sit just outside the collar like so. And so we're going to set that there. Then we're going to balance that on top. A wonder of wonders, that actually acts like it's going to sit there. And then we'll use this press piece here, so we're pressing again against the bearing. Now, it might be actually more advantageous to find a smaller one so we can press against the inside of the bearing rather than the outside. Let's see if I've got a smaller piece. Okay, I needed both hands to set this up. But what this is an 1.25 inch socket on the top so that we're pressing against the inner bearing race. And then the little piece from my press kit, ball joint press kit on the bottom to support it. So ideally, and we're only pressing on the inside, and this will just press straight down. Easy peasy. Just like that. And the all-important thing here is now it's together. It turns freely, there's no rumble. And we're ready to reinstall it on the truck. So when putting it back together, there is this fella here that is a retainer on the back side of it. Torque spec is 57 foot-pounds. And then 4 bolts onto the block, torque to 18 foot-pounds. And now we're ready to install the fan pulley. That just slips over. Line up the holes and then install the bolts and tighten to 7 foot-pounds is the torque spec. That installed, bolts tightened, torqued. If you're playing along on the home game, this is now the point where you would install your clutch fan. In my application, this will probably just going to be an idler because I expect to use an electric fan, in which case I may come back and do some paint touch-up just to prevent rust on that bare metal. But otherwise, that's the fan pulley, fan hub reinstalled. Continuing on with reassembly, we're going to go ahead and put the injectors into the block here. Injectors just came back from the rebuild shop. They have been serviced, cleaned, and prepped up, ready to be put back in. Let's see exactly what we were given here, because that will determine what we need to do from our reinstallation. That looks to be just a sticker. And I think we have 6 individually wrapped injectors. We also have a little baggie here. It says, at least on the surface, it says Bosch. Makes sense. So we have a set of 6. So those should be our copper sealing washers. And then inside the baggie we have one more, which will be one additional copper sealing washer. So that makes sense. Nothing else in that baggie. So we unwrap one of our injectors. That appears to be an injector that should be ready to install, although it's noteworthy there's a support here for an O-ring, and we did not get an O-ring back from the shop for the reinstallation. So I'm going to check my parts and determine whether or not I have those rubber O-rings available, or if we're going to install them without. All right. It does not appear that we were provided with these. And I remember when I took these apart, going back to the disassembly video, I had noted that there was a provision for an O-ring that was not used. So I will say the upper O-rings on these appear to be mostly gone or weren't installed when whatever previous work might have been done to them. So I'm going to assume, based on that, that this is in fact not a O-ring that is required. And as I look at this more closely, let's see if I can zoom this in so you can see it. Right in here, there's actually visible threads. So this may in fact not be an O-ring groove, but rather one to support this piece being removed from the end of the injector. With no further ado, we're going to set this up. Remove the little plastic cover. We'll start with our singleton seal. Now, again, this engine is clean. It's just been torn down, rebuilt, put back together from the machine shop. Otherwise, you would want to make sure that your injector bore was clean and ready to accept the injector. Now, I'm also going to point out this little knob on the injector here, and that corresponds to a notch in the cylinder bore that the injector needs to drop into. I will note that the seal does not hold onto the bottom of the injector. So if you pull it up, it's going to drop down in the hole and just sit down in there. And then you thread down the injector retainer until it is hand tight. And see if we can show that little notch at the bottom of the frame that the injector slots into. So now we're going to go ahead and set up the other 5 injectors, and then we'll come through and torque the injector retainers. Definitely feels like trying to get those seals to stay on the end of the injector for insertion is a bit of a losing proposition. As long as they drop in and seat at the bottom of the bore, they'll be fine. Now these are my original injectors that were rebuilt by Alliant Power here in Denver. They are actually a national operation. You can hit their website online, find more information about them. They do injector testing, evaluation, rebuild, injection pump testing, evaluation, rebuild. They also do turbochargers. In this case, I chose to have them rebuild the fuel pump and rebuild the injectors. I came across a really good deal on Rock Auto for what amounts to an upgraded turbocharger. It's actually the turbo from a 94 and up, which is a more or less a bolt-in option. It has a little bit faster spool, and otherwise basically is a drop-in. I think it's supposed to be like 1 inch difference in the positioning of the exhaust flange. So can involve a little bit of modification for the exhaust in a stock truck. It is a wastegated turbo, which means it has a pressure-driven wastegate to prevent an overboost condition, which is actually a little bit of an upgrade for this. A little bit faster spool up, I think I've already mentioned, which again will be a positive thing. Make a little bit more boost at lower RPMs for this engine. But the big thing was, as a purely economic decision, it was cheaper to get a brand new turbo, aftermarket, than it was to have the existing turbo rebuilt. If I have problems with it, in the end, I still have my stock turbo as a core or as a rebuild candidate, but it has bearing play that makes it not something I want to directly use on my brand new engine. And the more I look at these injectors and the way they go in, it makes a lot of sense there is not an O-ring at that upper position, because that O-ring would be somewhat redundant with the way the injector hold downs are set up. Because normally the O-ring is to prevent dirt from getting in along the sides of the injector. And in this case, that O-ring, or the hold down, is actually all the way around, and therefore actually would prevent that dirt from getting down into the injector bore. So not necessary for this style of injector. I think this may be the first time I've put together one of these that was set up with a purely mechanical injection system. I'm used to seeing injectors that are a lot larger physically and frankly a lot more complex than these are, dealing with slightly more modern systems that have more complicated injectors associated with them. Okay, that's 6 injectors in, 6 copper injector seals. Want to leave the caps on and fully seated until we're ready to put the injection lines on. I'm going to probably wait to put the injection lines on until this is actually in the truck, so that we don't end up messing them up while we're installing the motor. Next up, though, we want to go get our socket, and we'll torque the retainers down. 15/16 feels like it's a closer fit. And the torque spec is 44 foot-pounds. What I'm doing here is making sure that that seal, as it compresses, is not resulting in a loss of torque. Because that copper seal does compress under pressure. They are not reusable once torqued. And yeah, this one is compressing slightly. I think this one may require me to get a different angle. Yeah, that's going to require an extension. Okay. So the injectors are physically installed. And so when connecting your fuel lines, there's a series of banjo bolts that will go in here. And then on the top of the injector, you will connect your injection lines using the fitting on the line. Now I have a brand new set of banjo bolts for this, and I'm going to go ahead and screw those in. That'll help keep dust and dirt out of those connections while we're doing other things. So these are a Cummins part, and it actually comes as a kit with the banjo bolts and the little copper, again, seals for the banjo. So we'll kind of park things in place so they don't get lost along the way here. So what we're going to do is take a banjo bolt and just park the little copper connector on it and thread it in no more than hand tight, but it's actually going to probably bottom out into the injector. When you connect your return fuel line, that will go, in the middle of these little saddles. Let's see if we can get you in a little bit closer. You see this last one. You take the banjo bolt with the saddle on it and just thread it into that hole. So that's all prepped, closed up as best we can to keep the dirt out for reinstallation. I think next up we're going to go ahead and reinstall our thermostat and thermostat housing. What the machine shop did was not reinstall this housing, not reinstall the thermostat or the seals and gaskets that are associated with it. And they actually borrowed 3 bolts from what I think was the intake to put this in place. So the first thing we got to do is remove these three bolts. Because these guys are really short. Now, trust me, we don't want to lose our lifting bracket. That's important. But we do need to replace these 3. These 3 are the correct bolts for the thermostat housing. And this is the thermostat housing that will orient like so with the lifting eye sandwiched in the middle. And it does sandwich in the middle because it can't really go any other way. So the shorter bolt, the longer bolt, and the longer bolt, and figure out what the correct orientation there is. And now we need to go get the thermostat and the appropriate gasket. All right. So this is the gasket that we pulled out when we were working with the thermostat originally. And this is the new replacement thermostat gasket. And I believe the correct orientation for this, drop the thermostat in there and follow it up with the gasket, which is a nice big thick piece that will ultimately seal against this flat surface. The configuration of this water neck and thermostat housing is a little bit different on the newer motors, the ISBs, 24 valve common rails, etc. One bolt just doesn't quite want to thread in by hand. Here we go. At this point, we should be playing the guess the torque spec for all of the exterior bolts on this engine. These are, once again, 18 foot-pounds torque. Checked, and double checked. And so that covers the install of the thermostat and the thermostat housing. So next up, we're going to reinstall an AC compressor bracket. It's kind of a combined, two birds with one stone kind of arrangement on this side of the motor, where it has the inlet for the water pump and supports the AC compressor if you're using it. AC compressor will probably not be used in my application, so this may be just a dummy piece, or could even potentially be removed if I don't need it, or even possibly look for a different water pump inlet, although this is part of the alternator support bracketry, so I do need that piece. Anyway, let's go ahead and put this in. The first piece that we need to do is install our gasket, basically another O-ring that just sits there. It does sit just a little bit proud, which is good because then it'll compress down against the backside of the plate. Line it up, start a bolt. Like everything else, start by getting all of your bolts started before you tighten anything down. This piece does have a couple of interesting guide pins on it that actually appear to register against the front of the block. Probably makes assembly easier at the factory. Okay, and there are 3 larger bolts that go in behind the AC bracket. And the torque spec for the water pump inlet is 32 foot-pounds. And so because of the O-ring behind there, I'm going to torque these down first, and then I'll come torque these others. That one needed a little bit of a thin wall socket to get it down there. Okay. So with that, we have the water pump inlet installed. Mostly because I don't have a better place to stow it for the time being, I'm going to go ahead and attach the alternator bracket here to the thermostat housing. And again, this is just mostly because that gets it out of my way, and I can let it flop here on the engine for the time being until I'm ready. Have not decided what I'm doing for an alternator on this engine yet, because I know that I want to do some kind of a one-wire setup, but I'm also very tempted to want to set up a trail welder on this vehicle, so it would need a higher performance alternator than is stock. So I know I will be doing something, just have not decided what. That gets the alternator bracket out of my way, off my shop floor, and attached to the vehicle where it belongs. All right, probably the last item for today is I'm going to go ahead and install this passenger side engine mount. We have passenger side and driver side mounts that are basically identical. I think they even have the same set of casting numbers. Yeah, 3912781, 3912781, back L11. So left and right are the same part on both sides. You just orient them appropriately. Now, I did go back to the video when we did our teardown earlier to determine which way this should be oriented. And it came off in this orientation. So that's the orientation that we're going to put it back in on, with a little bit of Loctite on our bolts, and just thread this one on. And the torque spec on these is 44 foot-pounds. And that is the motor mount reinstalled. I can't do the driver's side until I'm ready to take the engine off the stand, but this is at least one less thing that still remains to be done. If you like what we do us a favor, like, subscribe, comment, and share.